As the word tactical implies, artisans know their way around in the world, their senses finely tuned to concrete reality. However, while the crafters are attuned to the tool and its uses, the composers are attuned to sensory variation, which gives them an extraordinary ability to work with the slightest nuances of color, tone, texture, aroma, and flavor. This observant sensuality seems to come naturally to the ISFPs, as if inborn. While a few of these artisans become world famous, composers in general are very difficult to observe, making this type probably the least understood of all. Perhaps such misunderstanding comes from their tendency not to express themselves verbally but through action. Like the ISTPs, ISFPs are usually not interested in developing facility in speaking or conversation. The spoken word, after all, is not as handy as the tool, and composers prefer to have their fingers on their compositional tools and through them feel the pulse of life. That pulse must be felt by touch, in the muscles, in the eyes, in the ears. This insistence on the senses being so closely attuned to concrete reality can, in some ISFPs, occasion a breach with language, such that they give up rather easily in their attempts to express themselves verbally. But this reluctance in speech is not so much a lack of ability as disinterest. If composers find a medium of expression, some art form, then they will express their character quite eloquently via that medium. If not, it simply doesn't come out, and so no one knows them, their reticence leaving their character all but invisible. Again, in those rare cases where remarkable skill is achieved, such as in the virtuoso, ISFPs can become celebrities, but their nature is still far from visible. And all of that, leads me to think, okay, what's, an example of that? Because I say, well, I have been interested in developing the spoken word and speech, but it really is because of particular interests I have. So as a kid, that description, probably fit very well for me in the sense of I didn't have any particular interest in talking to people just for the sake of talking to people. So the aspect when he talks about developing conversation, and there are some types of people that in itself is something that's important to them. And as a kid, it never was for me. Conversation was a means to an end, not something that I pursued for its own sake. And I think it started to change because one of the main interests that I've had since I was a kid was radio, and everything that goes into radio and the whole production element, not just music, not just talk, not just DJs or everything that goes into a radio station, a presentation of radio was interesting to me, from the commercials to the DJs, to the sweepers and the promos and the identity that particular station had. What made it different than another station? What separated it from something else? And I appreciated, all those little elements of that, and so much that to me the thrill was in when I would find a new station I hadn't heard before. I loved just listening to those elements of the station and seeing what they sounded like. And that's one of the things that became less and less thrilling in recent years when so many radio stations became owned by the same few corporations, and everything became so much more cookie cutter, where you have stations in all over the country that have very, very similar sound and presentation because they reuse the same jingles, the same sounds, the same formats, and sometimes even the same exact DJs are voice tracking shifts for a bunch of different radio stations. And so you've got the same person doing the afternoon drive DJ shift, for instance, in Belton, Texas, as Topeka, Kansas, as Jamestown, New York. It's the same person. And so there's a lot less variety from place to place, at least in the U.S. I'm not talking as much about internationally because I haven't listened to a whole lot of international radio, so that's not where my expertise lies. But anyway, as I developed my interest in radio, I always liked to create. I never wanted to just observe. I've always wanted to, in everything, create my own versions of stuff, put my own spin on things, put my own take on whatever it was, and create something based on what reality was. And this is something I've talked about before when the issues come up in Vint and in other places where I was talking about the difference in kind of the, I guess mainly the NF versus SP kind of point of view when it comes to imagination and creativity and stuff, because I think not that that the other two temperaments don't do that, but that a lot of the kind of artistic works and things like that tend to come from more SPs and NFs than anybody else, and the difference in approach tends to be, I think, that NFs tend to kind of have more of a fantasy element of creating things that are not real, that come from kind of an imagination of what could possibly be. Here's what kind of amazing, fantastic things can I come up with that don't exist and create this, wonderful fantasy thing of it. And that can be extremely entertaining, especially when it comes to books and movies that have been made with fantasy elements and some things like Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter, and those that have become really popular with these entire fictional worlds and the Narnia Chronicles and just lots and lots of other stuff where there's a whole lot of creativity put into creating this kind of other world that isn't our own. Whereas I think usually the SP approach to that is more of it's more reality based, but it doesn't mean that it's any less creative or imaginative. It just means that there's a basis sort of starts in reality, and then we take those elements and change them or create things based on them. And that's what I did as a kid with, and still do, but especially when I first started listening to a lot of radio, and I would make up my own radio stations and my own ideas, first in my head, and then I started writing them down about how I would do, how my station would be presented, how everything would sound, how the jingle package and the DJs and the music and the commercials, the transitions, everything that went into it, how it would sound. And so part of that was, as I got older and wanted to act out those things, then I did develop my voice and speaking more, because it was an element of that. And then radio wasn't the only interest I had and the only thing that required speaking, but that was probably the interest I had the most that sort of led me to start developing speech communication beyond just the necessary things for survival as a kid in terms of getting along at school and home and wherever else I went. So what's first interested me in developing more of that speech was the interest I had in radio. So in terms of the description I read of that element of ISFPs not developing speech as much, or the spoken word as much as action, I still believe that's true, and probably for a lot of us it's because our particular interest might lie in something that doesn't require speech. The fine arts that they talked about, like dancing or painting, or some of these other kind of things, writing, and that if it didn't require developing speech communication, like he said, we wouldn't necessarily have an interest in it. It wouldn't be required, so it would be a waste of time to us if that's not what we're focused on. So I agree with that element of it. At the same time, I can say that it's one of those areas where I differ a little bit from the base description, because I'm one of the people who has developed interest in things that require more speech and things like that. including what I'm doing now. So, anyway, that will conclude this part, and feel free to join me in the next one.